everybody, and welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. For today's podcast episode, our guest is Dr. Cole Napper. He received his master's and PhD in IO psychology from Louisiana Tech University, currently works as the vice president of people analytics for Orgnostic, and is a co-host for his very own people analytics podcast called Directionally Correct. Welcome, Cole. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome. You left out the most important part. It's the #1 people analytics podcast. That's
out. Is it in the? You have that like on the title?
Not in the title. No, I'm messing with you. Let's have some fun.
Well, hopefully we could become the #1 IO Hofstra student. There's probably a couple extra things before that we need to add.
I think we're already at that one right there, Joe. You gotta set your aspirations a little higher.
Well, we're excited to have you on today because we've had people analytics has been a topic that's kind of like come across our cohort at Hofstra and other IO students that we've talked to, but it's not like a generally known thing. I feel like in our community, it's kind of something that we learned about. So when we got to meet you at PsyOp and just talk about people analytics, it was really interesting. When you were in grad school and getting your doctorate and your master's, was this like a topic that you knew of, or did you kind of like learn about it later on?
No, it didn't exist back then. I mean, there were people that were doing what now we would call people analytics in the workforce back when I was in graduate school, but it was not branded as such. So I really started out my career doing selection and assessment work, which then morphed into workforce planning work, which then morphed into workforce analytics, which then got rebranded as people analytics. So I just kind of started out doing the core IO stuff that we all learn about. And then eventually my analytics chops took me into the people analytics space. Now, that said, if you're in an IO program now and you haven't heard of people analytics, I don't know what rock you've been living under, because I don't know the exact numbers, but I would say at least a third of people analytics practitioners are probably IO psychologists of one way, shape, or form.
No, that's fair. I definitely didn't hear about it in like when I came into the program. I feel like the same's probably for you too, Brandon.
Yeah.
But I think from what I heard is that sometimes it could fall under like different titles. I don't know if you've seen that, but like if I want to like work in people analytics and like I'm looking for people analytics jobs on LinkedIn or Indeed or something like that, you could do the same sort of task, but it might have a different title. Does that sound like something?
I mean, there's people like that have a million different variations of it, like talent insights or HR, workforce analytics or whatever. But I think the commonly understood umbrella term now, at least, is people analytics.
Definitely. I think that's a good way to talk about it too. Like when we think about people analytics, we can mention that it's not just always going to be under this same title of people analytics. You can look at all these other careers as doing the same thing that you would do in people analytics. And Cole, I wanted to ask you about the work that you did in selection. So specifically in regards to people analytics, how did that prepare you for once you started like moving and changing your position into people analytics?
I mean, in some ways it didn't, obviously. I would say, more generally speaking, the concepts of reliability and validity, but especially what I would say in the selection space of criterion-related validity studies, are more preparatory of what you would get into, which would be like diagnostic and predictive analysis. Right. And because if you really structure a criterion related validity study, it's pretty similar to trying to predict something like turnover. It's not exactly the same. You're probably going to use a different kind of sampling mechanism. You're going to split your data using more sophisticated techniques for any kind of predictive work that you would do, like maybe a K-folds cross-validation or something like that. But generally speaking, those get you into the mindset, which in my opinion, is the most important thing about like, how would you know using the scientific method to do some of this work And IO psychology does a pretty dang good job of preparing you for that compared to other disciplines. That's not to say it does an amazing job. It's just other disciplines do an even worse job than IO psychology does, generally speaking. And therefore, I think it is we're more natural bedfellows than maybe some other disciplines.
Okay, no, it makes sense. I mean, at least in like our classes that we have, especially this semester, the ideas of validity and reliability, like conducting tests, like using those different forms, are heavily uh, shown. Like our teachers like need us to know that stuff. Um, do you have when you work with other people in people analytics? Are these terms not like generally thrown around if they come from a different background? Do you see it more with just like IO people that like this terminology is more known?
Yeah, I'm. When we did a session at PsyOp this year on careers and people analytics for IO psychologists, and so I'm sure many of the people in your audience who are interested in this space probably attended that session because there was a ton of people there. It was probably 300 people there. But I'll say something now that I said then. Um, I've gone fully native on people analytics. Like I have almost completely abandoned my IO psychology lexicon, and it's not because I don't love IO psychology anymore. I probably use it more than most IO psychologists do out in the workplace. It's just I find that when you're an IO psychologist, you become very regimented in the use of words and terms that confuse the hell out of everybody else, right? And so we get in these positions where we can only talk to each other because we have a very conserved set of words and terms that no one else is using. And so I just try to speak in a very basic lexicon about this stuff and use the words that are most simple. And even though IO psychologists might frown upon that or something, I don't really care because I'm more effective as a consequence.
Cole, that is a good segue to our next point. So, being somebody who did present at PsyOp, you probably met with a lot of students as you did meet with us. When you were talking to those students, were you talking to them more about the IO psychology world in relation to people analytics, or were you talking to them more about the actual like people analytics world you're in?
I don't know if I understand the difference between those two things. Um, most of the people, if somebody comes up and talk, this is kind of a cynical take. If somebody comes up and talks to you after you present at SIB, generally speaking, they're looking for a job. So most of the people I'm talking to either A, are looking for a job or a referral to somebody else who's hiring or something like that. The second most is just people who are looking for mentorship, just more generally speaking. It could be about anything, but likely it's mentorship about the topic that you're talking about. I honestly, when I speak, I don't get that many questions about the content of like a career in people analytics because guess what? We just covered that. Like the session was literally about that. People got to ask questions. The whole panel got to weigh in because it was a panel and there was a lot of really esteemed people in association to myself. So, and then there's people who are just looking for like, friendship, mutual connections. Hey, did you have so and so as your advisor? Or hey, did you work with so and so at whatever company? And that can be fun. Generally speaking, I'm just looking for people who want to be friends, who want to have like a real who's somebody who wants to go get a beer after psyop. Like that would be amazing. So I don't know. I don't really get too many technical questions about this type of stuff after I present.
So do you have to shoot down a lot of job offers? Not offers, people asking for jobs.
No, I mean it's a lot. Honestly, it's a lot easier when you're not hiring because then you
That's
can just
fair.
say, "Hey, I'm not hiring right now." But I would say like what I will do if somebody's legitimately interested, I'll give them the ringer of like, "Hey, here's what it's going to take to find a job." I give people advice all the time on this front. Very few people actually take the advice, which to me is an indicator of a few things. One is just a lot of times my advice is going to take a lot of time and effort, and they're just like, I don't have that much time, so I'm just not going to do it. But the other thing is, I actually think of it like a multiple hurdles selection process of sometimes people are just self selecting out and saying, oh, if this is what it takes to truly demonstrate your passion for people analytics, maybe it's not for me. And that's fine. That's actually a really good result because, everybody's got to make choices in life about what they want to do. But the advice I typically give is just be unstoppable. And what I mean by that is there are so many free resources online. Like if you're ever paying for resources on how to learn how to do this stuff, you're doing it wrong. And so there's so many free resources on like just how to learn how to do predictive techniques, how to build a dashboard, how like I've written probably 30 articles on how to do people analytics. All of them are free, and there's still way more to learn than those 30 articles, but geez, 30 free articles is a pretty good starting point for learning about a field, right? And then just go spend 2 hours a week finding a data set, spend one of those hours analyzing the data set, and spend the other hour building presentations and recommendations on what you found from that data set. And guess what? That does a few things. First of all, it gives you the repetitions. A lot of what being good at something is just repetitions. But the second thing is it'll give you a corpus of materials that you've created that you can demonstrate to other people that you're good at something. So you can say like, hey, here's 30 presentations I made over 30 weeks on a particular set of topics, and you say, I'm actually world class at this, even though I've never worked for a company and done this before. Like you can become world class at something and never have done it in the real world. And that's what I mean by being unstoppable. Like if I was a hiring manager for someone, I would hire that person in a heartbeat because they seem like it's like, gosh, they're passionate about it. They're a self starter. They're an autodidact. They're going to teach themselves. These are the things that I'm looking for. Not every hiring manager is. Maybe some people are just really hung up on credentials. I tend to not be hung up on credentials, and that's really uncommon for a person with a PhD to say that. But I really want someone who is passionate about this area.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's awesome to hear. And, through the people that Joe and I have talked to in people analytics, we've noticed that like that is a very common thing for them to tell us. It's like, just get practice, really go out there and see what resources you have at your disposal and just try to use them because, Joe and I have started taking that advice and moving forward with it. And we've already seen it help us out in the long run, like really quick. Wouldn't you say, Joe?
No, yeah, I was gonna say it's funny enough. Brandon and I and a couple other students have like started to plan like our little people analytics project of our own. And I actually wanted to ask you, and it's not just advice for us, but it's for anyone who wants to create their own project. There's a lot of languages and software out there, and we tried to do some research on like kind of like what companies use what sort of like languages, whether it's R or Python or a mix of both, or I don't know if anyone uses Jamovi or, but that's like what we learned in grad school. I don't think so.
Jamovi's great. There's nothing wrong. Like I actually will probably take a little bit of credit for the fact that you guys learned using Jamovi because I was one of the people who started pushing that out to folks, like saying, "Hey, this is a free language that's out there. You should be checking it out." So I wouldn't be surprised if a friend of a friend was actually made that happen at your school because it's not very well known.
No,
But
really isn't.
I'm a big proponent of doing stuff for free. And the thing I would say, just kind of to get to your question, Joe, is do it. Just do it. Like get with your friends, invest in language. Like, some teams are R teams, some teams are Python teams. I'm not going to wade into that debate. Like that, the people argue about this senselessly for hours on the internet. It's so stupid. And the thing is, at most teams, like, there's a few organizations that have, 20 different, people analytics data scientists, and they have to choose a language, right? Because they need interoperability. That's actually the exception, not the rule. Most people analytics teams are very small. And if you're in a very small team, that means you get to choose your weapon of choice, right? So just be good at something. Like the worst thing that you can be is not very good at a lot of things. And I would much rather somebody who's really good at like one or two or maybe three things than somebody who is very poor at like 12 things.
No, it makes sense. It's actually kind of comforting now because I think we're thinking about doing Python, so it's nice that it doesn't matter if there's like a certain specific one. I had a follow up question though. I know we talked about like dashboards and certain like reports. in people analytics projects, like if students are trying to like make these projects and like they do their analyses, is there like a standard that the way they do a write up, or is it kind of up to the team or like what kind of project they want to do, whether it's like
Oh my
visualization of
gosh.
like certain graphs and stuff, or is it more like academic paragraphs? I don't know if there's like a certain way that people do it.
It's none of that. See, this is where I know very prominent people in our field who are IO psychologists that say it takes a year to deprogram a grad student when they get into the job world because they come back and think they need to write a 20-page report about everything. And that's just like, what are you doing? Right? Bullet points, executive summaries, very simple and easy to enact recommendations. And this is where we kind of get out of the depth of biopsychology. Things like the ability to calculate the ROI of a study is really important, right? And a lot of times there's a difference. This is another thing we didn't really learn in graduate school between a project, which is more of like the scientific method, and like a product, which is creating something that's going to stand on its own, like an actually like web application, who is going to do work for people to be able to answer their own questions rather than coming to you and saying, "Hey, can you do this 3 month or 6 month study for me?" That actually is a not a rare occurrence. It's just in terms of how teams apportion their time, they can only apportion a small amount of time to these heavy lift studies. But most of what they're working on, generally speaking, is trying to build scalability. And the only way to build scalability is by building products on like how for people to answer their own questions.
Okay,
That makes
kind of
sense. Yeah.
like is is that kind of like what the company you work for, Orgnostic, does? Is it like a software
Yeah.
that helps companies basically?
And I guess this is probably a good juncture here to say like most of the advice I gave up on this call is the advice I've been giving for like 10 years. The problem is generative AI came like 6 months ago. And a lot of what it's doing is upsetting the apple cart of a lot of the traditional ways of doing things. So there might be a time in the future where you never code in R or Python, right? And so, like my company, Orgnostic, that I work for, it does a lot of this stuff using automation before generative AI existed. But we're the first people analytics platform that has leaned into generative AI. And what does that mean? That means once you have all of your data sources in our tool, you can actually go in and just ask it a question and it'll generate a dashboard with a text write up of what the dashboard is saying and a sourcing of the academic literature generating prescriptions and recommendations on what you should do about the problem that was identified via the question you asked, which is fundamentally crazy. Like as an IO psychologist, like if I rewound into graduate school, that like would blow my mind, right? But fundamentally, that's a phase shift in how people analytics is done and how IO psychology is done. Once these technologies become more pervasive, the thing that I actually think like graduate students should be leaning into is how do I develop my critical thinking skills? And I wrote an article on this called The Inquisitor and the Change Agent. I'll probably send it to you after this is over, where I talk about this in detail. Because if analytics is really a 3-step process in its most simple form, it's asking good questions, it's doing analysis, and then it's taking action. The middle step, the analysis step, is largely being automated by generative AI, right? Most people don't realize it because most people don't work for a company like I work for, right? But we're going to be more pervasive, and this is going to pervade into the academic sphere as well over time. Once that happens, what you need to do the first step and the third step, though, is critical thinking. It takes a very inquisitive mind. That's why I call it the Inquisitor, to ask world class research questions and generate testable hypotheses. That requires a lot of domain expertise and critical thinking. The other step, which I call the change agent, which is taking action based on the results, that requires a ton of critical thinking, the ability to influence, and the ability to execute. All of those things are very challenging. So, as students, it's probably good to learn the fundamentals and know how to do a lot of these like modeling techniques, but also it's going to be really important to be ability to have the ability to take action based on those models and to the ability to ask the right questions in the first place, which I think IO psychology and people analytics practitioners are surprisingly well suited to do compared to the general person that's in an HR function, because they are not well suited to do a lot of these things.
Definitely. I think the big call out there too, like you mentioned, is the asking of a question. I think that we look at that in a lot of places, not just when you're looking at conducting any sort of analyses or anything like that, but also when you're working in a position in general. Like you have to make sure that you're asking the right questions to keep yourself and your coworkers on the right track and also moving forward in the right direction. And I think that kind of leads us to another question that Joe and I have thought about when talking about our project specifically. I don't really have much knowledge on this, so Cole, maybe you can give it to us. When we're using Python to try and code whatever data sets we're going for, um, the use of those free data sets, is there any difference of like what you pull and how like a Python would read versus an R? And I'm asking this only as someone who's still learning like this week about Python and R, so it's definitely a question that we've been looking into.
This is where I get into, because like I learned R after graduate school. So in graduate school, I learned zero R, and I was completely self taught in this space. And one of the things that I feel like is a shortcoming of a lot of the ways that you learn these tools, whether it be R or Python, is like if I were teaching a course on how to do this, I would say, okay, here's how to pull in a data set, here's how to clean it, here's how to do some analysis, and then here's how to interpret that analysis. But what they do is they force feed you, like, here's how to transform one variable into another variable. It's like teaching like basic math on how to like do these tools. And it's like, I just want to know how to create a data frame or a matrix or something like that, and then just learn how to plug and play. And they just won't do that. And so it's incredibly frustrating. And so one of my hypotheses is that the user friendliness of these tools is going to have to increase dramatically, or their adoption is going to fall to zero as the adoption of things like generative AI pervade more broadly. Because again, eventually, this doesn't exist today except in places like Orgnostic. Eventually, you're just going to load your data set into probably some kind of GPT framework and then ask it questions on how to analyze that data set, right? And it might even be with, like, right now it's text, but eventually it might be voice, right? And that's not too far in our future. This isn't like a sci-fi movie. Like, these tools are being developed right now. And that means that they're going to be like betas in 6 to 12 months, which means that they're going to be like real, like functional products on the market in 24 to 36 months, which means by the time you leave graduate school, these things are going to be pervasive in the marketplace.
I know you touched upon it a bit with Alexis Fink in the one we got to attend at SIOP. And I think the general consensus was that generative AI won't replace jobs, but it'll change them. If you have a thought on that, whether it's like, I know some people are like, oh, AI is coming, like we're all going to be out of jobs, like they're just going to be able to do everything. Or is it more like the type of day-to-day tasks that we'll be doing will just be different, like what you just said? It's plugging it in.
Yeah. I mean, so I have a few thoughts on this. One is that's actually why I wrote The Inquisitor and the Change Agent. I'm writing another article right now about the people analytics operating model in the age of generative AI, because I talk to a lot of people about this, and many people are nervous, like, oh, is it going to take my job? And I've heard this expression said by many other people, but I'll say it again in case people haven't heard it. It's like, AI is not going to take your job. Somebody using AI is going to take your job. Right. So that means that you need to be a person who's adept at using AI rather than just, a dinosaur or something. But the other thing I say is the future is not a foregone conclusion. And what I mean by that is people can build really, messed up stuff that's going to make our future very dystopian, or they could choose to build tools that make our future awesome. And that's a really human choice. And so one of the things I always tell my teams, and I say this at Orgnostic quite often, is don't build the future you don't want to live in, right? Don't create the future you don't want to be a part of. And so one of the things that we focused heavily on, and what is the future about AI that I'm really excited about, is let's create tools that automate the stuff that nobody wants to do. It's all the stuff we have to do. We have to do it. We've been having to do it. It takes up so much of our time. It's a pain in the butt. Well, if I'm a humanist, why don't we automate half that stuff or 80% of that stuff? Right? Get AIs to do it, because goodness gracious, that's going to improve everybody's quality of life, and it's going to open up opportunities again for the person who's using AI to be really impactful in the business. Now, my only worry, and I talked with Scott about this on our podcast the other day, is some of that low value added stuff someone actually might like doing. It's not going to be everything, but like he used the example, and this is our example of ggplot. Like AI is probably going to come in and automate the ability to do ggplots. Well, he loves making ggplots. And so in some ways that might diminish your quality of life if you're not getting to do his ggplots as much as you would like to do. But all that to say, I suspect, and this is what usually happens as tools get developed, as they become more user friendly, it's more of a co-creation process with the tool than it is, the tool completely replaces the human element of what is being done. And so I suspect, even though the interface of doing things like ggplot might change because of AI, I imagine the co-creation process won't change much at all, and it will still be intellectually stimulating and enjoyable like it was before.
Definitely. Like Joe and I have this conversation all the time about just the different uses that people are going to find in AI as time keeps going on. And there's a lot of really cool things out there that are changing in the world that we live in. And it's amazing to hear the stuff that Orgnostic is doing as well. We want to leave you with our final question that we ask all of our guests. And we've kind of touched on a lot of topics here in this podcast, but I want to ask you, Cole, personally, what is like one key piece of advice that you could give incoming graduate IO students before they enter the field?
We were kind of touching on this before the call, but don't be a freaking nerd. Gosh, like you can learn so many amazing things, and you can geek out being an IO psychologist, and that's fundamentally almost like a rite of passage when going through these programs. One of my professors said to me in graduate school, a PhD gives you a license to learn. And I really took that to heart. And so what that meant to me is after I left graduate school, that I didn't just expand my domain knowledge of IO psychology as time passed and as I gained experiences and kept up with the field and went to conferences and all that, yada, yada. I actually expanded beyond IO psychology. So it became IO psychology rather than IO psychology only. And so I would really encourage folks to really dive in while they're in graduate school, but don't just be a nerd who only looks at themselves in the mirror. Be someone who expands their horizons, become interdisciplinary, become a person who's a well-rounded human being who's interesting to talk to at cocktail parties. Like these are the kind of cool people that are going to make IO psychologists the prominent figures in our society that they should be. Nobody wants a one-trick pony. They want someone who's, fun to get a beer with or fun to talk to. Be that kind of person, be well-read, have a variety of experiences. These are the things that make life worth living.
It's definitely great advice, especially because IO, I feel like gives you a great structure to build upon like other certain fields. I mean, I bet a whole bunch of other students are like this too. I mean, we talked about it on this podcast before, but I know a lot of psych students come from like clinical or school to IO, and those fields you only do is clinical or school. But in IO, there's so many different things you could do, and it kind of helps you branch off into maybe a more analytical field or something in the complete opposite way. And if you can utilize that and help you learn about, like you said, a whole bunch of different fields, it could only benefit you.
Well, here's something to think about too is that the half-life on knowledge and skills is decreasing by the day. And what that means is there was a point in time where you could get a PhD in something and the knowledge that you learned would really last you the rest of your career, right? Well, the half-life on knowledge is decreasing all the time. So that means when you leave your PhD, you may have to reinvent your career 2, possibly even 3 times. And so think about this in the sense of if you're going to broaden your horizons, that's going to help set you up not just for your next 10 years of your career, but the next 3 careers that you might have. And that's an exciting thing. That's not a scary thing. I crave variety personally. And so the ability to have that license to learn, I mentioned, is really important to the ability to reinvent yourself over time.
Definitely, and I do want to add too, like when you're talking about learning and growing yourself, it's awesome to get involved with the people around you. And you kind of talked about it, like you want to be somebody that people go grab a beer with. And as IO psychologists, I think we've got a really good job at, or done a really good job at creating this comfortable environment for everybody to meet and be social. But don't be afraid to go out of that as well. Like going into IO, you can talk to IO psychologists, but using your knowledge in IO, you could talk to anybody else as well. And I think that that's something that we could also be seeing that could help grow that field and make people more aware of what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, like it's fun to go to a thing like SciOp because at least you don't have to explain what psychology is, and that can be like a 20-minute exercise and get really annoying really quickly, right? And so it's good to kind of like have that sense of in groupness amongst one another. But if you can talk to anyone, you can also talk to psychologists. But if you can't, if you can only talk to psychologists, that doesn't mean you can talk to anyone. And so if you can build the skill of learning to influence and network and just build genuine relationships with any human being, that can be really valuable outside of the IO field as well.
So I think the moral of the story is we're gonna have Cole on for a part two, but it's just gonna be a happy hour, and we're gonna talk about networking the entire time.
If that's what you guys want to talk about, I'm down. I want to talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Oh, I think we floated the idea around of actually doing like a happy hour podcast. We just haven't gotten around to it. It would actually be kind of fun. I think we should try it out
I
one
will
day.
say it is kind of dangerous. We did that the other day, and your filter goes down quite substantially. Like I was like, oh, I'm using a lot more curse words than I normally do on the podcast, but it was a lot of fun too. So
Well,
I don't know.
once we
Just don't get
graduate,
fired or
Once
yeah.
you
Make sure
graduate.
you're able to graduate afterwards.
we'll wait till we're out of school. um, but that was great. Thanks for joining us, Cole. I think it's a great people analytics episode. I'm hoping that a lot of students will be able to listen to it and uh, learn about a field that's really, really interesting.
100%.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cole.
So that was a great episode with Cole. Back by popular request is people analytics, and I think we got a lot more useful information too. So like we keep getting all this stuff, and it's so interesting. Like I feel like we're just hitting the surface on what people analytics has to offer.
Yeah, I definitely want to try our best to get more people in that people analytics space because I know it's not just us that enjoys like hearing about what they do. Um, and we have a people analytics like seminar in our program, right? Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, so yeah, we learn about people analytics, and it's I believe it's like only a couple weeks in our class, but we get to learn a little bit more than actually what I thought we had at first.
Yeah, because that was my point. Like, it would be nice to have like a people analytics course because I feel like there's so many grad students out there that we got to talk to that love hearing about like what these people actually do. Super
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And to add to that, like whether we have a course or whether our listeners have a course, we kind of touched on this with Cole, but I want to highlight it. There's so many resources at your disposal. Like for our listeners out there, really look and try to find those resources because they can be super helpful and they can give you a lot of insight into how to do anything in the people analytics space. And you can always reach out to Joe and I or any of our guests and ask them questions about people analytics because we're doing our own research on top of that, and they are the subject matter experts. They know so much. So
Yeah. Contrary to popular belief, Brandon and I know some things, so don't hesitate to reach out. But thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back next week.
yeah, see you guys.